I'm Tiffany Ramsey, the head of compliance and risk for Engaging Networks, and one of the things that I do is PCI compliance. Leah talked about in our kickoff session that we're also doing SOC 2 compliance, and we're also doing HIPAA compliance this year as well. But today we're going to focus on fraud. And I had breakfast this morning with Molly from Zurich Group. I don't know if Molly's here. And I mentioned to her what our topic was, and she just said, fraud is a part of the business. It's going to always be there. The main thing is how you manage it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, let me introduce or have them introduce themselves. So Chrissy, you want to talk?
Yeah. So Christy Watkins, Senior Product Manager at WorldPay. So I've been with WorldPay for 9 years or so, and I focus solely on our merchant fraud solutions. So building all of the different ways that we can protect payments and kind of all of the different points of vulnerability within the customer journey as they interact with all of you.
And I'm Josh Ackerman. I lead a group of product managers at Stripe, building a product called Radar, which is our fraud prevention product. Prior to this, I've worked on our authorization and acceptance products and our payment integration, so how you actually get started and use Stripe through Engaging Networks.
Very good, very good. So as I mentioned, we're talking about fraud today, and one of the reasons why we brought our payment gateways up here is that they are really your first line of defense when it comes to fraud management when we talk about this whole industry that we're in. So I'm going to let them do a lot of the talking. But I also want to mention that we have a special person in the audience here today from Engaging Networks, someone who's never been to, I think, to one of our conferences before, and he's our security compliance cybersecurity guru. So if you think of The Wizard of Oz, you remember that movie and the guy that was in the back behind the screen? Well, that's Ken Donaldson. And Ken's sitting here. Ken, you want to raise your hand? So he's here today, and I may just be calling on him. I will be calling on him for some input as we're starting to talk a little bit about the technical stuff. But I want to start with a show of hands. I've got a few opening questions for the audience. Let's see. Raise your hand if your organization has had a fraud attack in the past year. Let me see a show of hands. In the past 12 months. Okay. Just in general, not even Engaging Networks. If you've had a fraud attack in the past year, okay? Raise your hand if your executive team speaks about fraud on a regular basis. Just a couple, okay? And then raise your hand if fraud losses are one of your organization's top 3 priorities. One person, okay. That kind of gives us an indication. All right, so we're gonna dive into just some panel questions at this point. We don't have a lot of slides. We're gonna talk to you today. So the first general area we're going to look at are the biggest threats or issues that we're seeing. So my question to the panel is, what threats or issues are you seeing most in e-commerce and nonprofit spaces? What threats or issues?
So I think for me, the nonprofit space, as I sit here and listen to all the great things that you guys do, it's unfortunate, but card testing and bot attacks, I continue to see just completely take advantage of your websites, and it's never ending. Unfortunately, it's probably very cyclical. You see it kind of happen. It comes and goes in waves. And it really is, I think, the biggest one. I think you have a handful here or there with subscription-based that you might get some chargebacks and have a little bit of spike in chargebacks. But from my experience, just kind of working with Engaging Networks and the different merchants that work with us, you see the nonprofit is probably, in my mind, top 2 industries attacked by card testing and bot attacks for the last at least 3 years or so.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'll share some other types of fraud that we see, but maybe just to spend a moment, do folks know what card testing attacks are and why nonprofits and charities are especially vulnerable to this type of attack? Would it be helpful for me to talk about that for a second? So a card testing attack is basically when a bad actor goes on the dark web and purchases on the order of hundreds of thousands to millions of stolen card numbers. They then will basically try and figure out which of these stolen cards are actually valid and real. And do they have like the fullest details associated with that card? So they want to figure out like, do I actually have the full 16-digit PAN number and a real expiration date and a real CVC code on the back of that card? Now, why are they taking advantage of you as charities and nonprofits and donation platforms? Well, basically, many of you enable the customer to actually choose how much they want to donate. So they could donate just $1. Whereas if you're going on a website to purchase like a good or a service, oftentimes you're buying that good or service for $10, $20, $50, $100. These card testers want to try and skirt under the ecosystem as much as they possibly can and basically test as many cards as they can with as little value as they can. So they come to all of you, not because they're doing you any favors, quite the opposite, because they're taking advantage of you. They're running all of these single dollar transactions through your ecosystem to try and figure out which of these card networks are valid and real. So we see a tremendous number of bad actors that will try and take advantage of charities and nonprofits for that reason. We also see moments where there's a good amount of friendly fraud or first-party misuse. So this is when someone might make a real donation. Maybe they set it up as a recurring subscription, but then 2 or 3 months later, they file a chargeback and say, I never signed up for that subscription. We also do see some bad actor fraud where it's maybe an internal employee or someone who has access to the data, whether it be about the payments or about information associated with donations. And there can be bad actors internally who take advantage too.
Very good. Ken, did you want to add to that? Okay.
I was just going to say, hopefully this is not to like scare all of you. It's actually just to have a conversation about what to do about it.
Yes, I mean that's the key is what to do about it, because as I mentioned before, fraud is going to be in our industry. It's something that has been there. It's going to continue to be there, and it's all about managing that risk now at this point. So we talked about threats and issues. What are the most prevalent fraud risks impacting nonprofits in digital fundraising? So what's the most prevalent? You talked about card testing. What else are we seeing?
I think that kind of is the most prevalent that we see continue to happen. As Josh mentioned, there are some other times that bad actors get through. I think, as we see the spread of fraud happening and these bad actors kind of popping up, one of the things that I think about is, it used to take a unique individual to go out there in the dark web and then be able to find stolen credit cards and come up with scripts to run and be able to kind of run these types of schemes. And I will say one thing that, technology has provided all of us to use in positive ways like ChatGPT and different AI to become faster and more agile and run our businesses better. Fraudsters are having the same type of access to that technology. And so it's opening the door to a lot more people to enter the fraud space, right? There's a fraud GPT out on the dark web, right? Where you don't have to be able to write your own scripts anymore. You don't have to be able to understand how a fraud scheme could work. You can ask AI to give you new ways to take advantage of businesses. It can go out there and it can look on the internet and find websites that might be more vulnerable, websites that don't require a lot of data capture or account login information. So, I think the scalability of fraud and the type of fraud that you guys see, because, as Josh, I think, did a really good job of explaining why there's such a vulnerability in the nonprofit space, I think the ease of entry that has happened now within the fraud space for bad actors to come in is really allowing it to scale to a really kind of out of control space where we do stay up all night thinking about how do we get ahead of it and how do we continue to prevent against these card testing attacks, these bot attacks, and these potential new fraud trends that could pop up.
Yeah, to give you a little bit of data here, when we took a look at, let's say, the past year, we actually see that fraud rates across the online payments ecosystem, this is not just for charities and nonprofits and donation platforms, but we actually saw that there was a 15% increase in fraudulent transactions over the course of the past year alone. And to Christie's point, a lot of that is driven by the new AI and ML capabilities that bad actors are using. Now, you basically need to, look to the three of us and other, payment providers to actually build and launch AI and ML to combat bad actors. And you need to make sure that our AI and ML is more efficacious than theirs. And so we actually took a look in that same time frame at, our data of charities and nonprofits that are using Stripe, and we saw that there was a 17% decrease in fraud across the Stripe ecosystem. And I just share that as an example to say, yes, bad actors are indeed using AI and ML, and they're using it to exploit charities and nonprofits, but we can also build AI and ML, and that AI and ML needs to be more powerful so that you don't have to worry about this as much.
Yeah, and just to explain, ML is machine learning, for those of you who may not not be aware of that. So that brings us to the next question is then, what are some of the things that we can do to thwart or manage this risk? What are we seeing? And let's start with maybe Stripe. You want to talk about what are some of the things that you guys are doing?
Sure. Maybe I could actually, Tiffany, just start with like a high level approach of like, how do we even think about this internally? And I like to think about it in terms of like a barbell graph where like you have a lot of transactions on either side of the barbell graph. What I mean by that is like, we want to get to a place where every transaction either is extremely low confidence, we know that this is definitively a bad actor, or on the other side, we want to know that this transaction is incredibly high confidence and is being made by a good actor. The transactions that actually scare me the most are the ones that are in the middle. The ones that are in the middle are the ones where we don't have enough information to try and figure out, is this a valid and real transaction, or is it a bad actor? And so the way that we think about things at Stripe is we basically try and take all of those transactions in the middle and we think about what additional information do we need to figure out what side of that barbell the transaction should fit on. Sometimes it's information about like the device that's being used, the IP address of where it's coming from. So we use some unique fingerprinting there. Other times we actually have to leverage an intervention, such as 3D Secure. And some of these interventions are not only great because they provide us with more data about the consumer who's making the transaction, but some of them, like 3D Secure as an example, it actually allows us to shift liability off of you and onto card issuers so that if there is a chargeback, you're not responsible for it. An issuer is responsible instead. And so we really think about like, okay, how do we create this barbell of transactions? And for the ones in the middle, how do we use interventions to get these transactions to either be incredibly low risk or incredibly high risk and then block them?
Yeah, I have to agree. I think anybody who's talked to me and my team at WorldPay would probably sick of hearing me say the word data and how important data is in the fight against fraud. And the more that you have, the better you can protect. And it's, just like when you are putting prompts into your Copilot or ChatGPT and asking, you're only going to get a response that's as good as the prompts that you put in. And with fraud, right, in order to kind of achieve that bar graph, to achieve competency at either a low risk or a high risk, it really comes down to the amount of data that you're able to capture and then use in a meaningful way. So when I say use in a meaningful way, pass to your acquirer, your payment partner, downstream to the issuers, and making sure that you're capturing as much as possible. And I will say, we noticed just at WorldPay with adding email address is a 12% reduction in fraud between a reduction in false positives and an overall reduction in actual fraud that we're capturing. So, that isolated, when you scale it, really starts to make a meaningful difference. One thing that we've started doing at WorldPay, and I know a lot of others are out there in the world doing it as well, is issuer data share programs. So similar to 3DS, where 3DS is kind of driven on the network rails, we are partnering with issuers such as Capital One, where we are now directly connecting into them. So within our fraud solutions, if you use our fraud solutions at WorldPay, you're getting a direct connection to Capital One, where we're passing enhanced data to them to allow them to make better decisions. And we've actually seen a 32% reduction in false positives. So it really becomes an optimization play as well. So we know, I think earlier one of the panels talked about how do you explain, deliverability and revenue? Like, how do you talk about that? And fraud really becomes a revenue play as well, right? So as much as your leadership might not be asking about, your fraud rates, or it might not be a top priority for them, the reduction in false positives by being the data, allowing more good traffic through, especially when you're vulnerable to card testing and these high velocity attacks. Because when you have those and you have no filter in place, or you don't have something kind of pre-network stopping it, you are going to see a huge increase in declines to your real donors and to the people that want to genuinely give, because the networks are just going to shut you down. They're going to start being more aggressive in declines for you if they see a mid that's just more vulnerable to fraud. So the more data you can pass, the better. And obviously friction is an important piece of that. And I think there's a lot now that allows customers to just click their email address in, click their address in one button. So friction's starting to reduce a little, but definitely understanding the data that you're capturing from your consumer, from your donors when you're interacting with them on that payments page, and then making sure you're passing that data through so that our fraud models can work as optimally as possible for you to allow good traffic through when a bad attack is happening.
Good. So let's switch gears a little bit here. The next question is, what role does compliance play in all of this, and how can nonprofits implement effective risk management frameworks? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start. So I think from a compliance perspective, right, there's a lot of regulations. There's a lot of, existing kind of rules that you have to comply with. I think it's a partnership. So from the payment side, one thing that's really important to us is we work with our compliance teams and our cyber, crime teams, and genuinely say, okay, it's an ecosystem, right? So payments is just one small sliver of that ecosystem. You have, account creation, you have know your customer sometimes, right? You have SAR, you have all of these different potential requirements that you need and potential areas of vulnerability before the payment even happens, making sure your website is secure, right? Making sure that, there's people trying to steal your data, right? Your data is secure. So it really is a partnership. It's understanding where those risks are, and everybody kind of coming together on a regular basis and making sure that you're addressing all of the potential risks within your organization. And I would say the biggest advice is don't operate in silos, right? Bring everybody together in a room. We like to have a monthly cadence with our cyber crimes team and with our criminal investigations team and the team that's literally out there on the dark web and doing all kind of the really cool stuff. We come together and we talk about, what are you guys seeing from a fraud perspective? Because we know when there's an increase in data being stolen, when there's an increase in phishing and scams, that's just ways people are getting credit card, social security numbers, all of that. So we expect there to be a spike come down the payment space, which then you can expect a spike in the chargebacks or disputes. So working together, staying connected across the ecosystem from a compliance perspective, making sure that you're, obviously staying compliant with all of the rules and regulations within your areas, but really working together and operating as one kind of team, and keeping that just an ongoing conversation so that, you're fully protected end to end and have that holistic view.
The only quick thing that I totally agree, and the only quick thing I would add there is just being judicious about what compliance you actually want to own and what you want to hand off. And so, Tiffany, to the point earlier about PCI compliance, that is something that at least we at Stripe recommend that basically no one own it. For like none of the businesses and nonprofits that run on Stripe own it. Instead, there are many pieces that you can actually just hand off to a payment processor, whereby you're integrating with our online checkout experiences, and then we handle the PCI compliance for you. And so I think, just to build on what Christy said, it's mostly about, hey, let's determine what compliance risks your nonprofit charity actually wants to take. And in many cases, I would say you shouldn't own any of the compliance pieces. We should own it for you.
That's the best answer.
Yeah, that's the
nothing.
best. Yeah, that's the best answer in an ideal world, right? But, we talk about, and one of the things that I've talked about over the last year and a half that I've been here is this whole shared responsibility model, right? That they're, and I mentioned the payment gateways are your first line of defense for fraud management. But, there's things that fall in your lap as a nonprofit, right? And let's think about how many of you are familiar with the SAQ, self-assessment questionnaire for PCI compliance, right? And how many of you in here are responsible for filling out those SAQs? Anybody? So we have a couple of people, right? And we talk about understanding what is required of your payment gateway. So if you go out to Stripe's PCI compliance page, they tell you what you need to do, right? They'll tell you what their part is in this, and then what your part is, and walk you through it. Fill out the SAQ, make sure you're getting scanned, all that stuff that we've been harping on. And the same thing with WorldPay or any other gateway that you go through. So it is true. It is. No one should own it, I guess. It's shared. All of us really own parts of it. And, obviously me being the head of compliance and risk, I'm going to be harping on PCI compliance. That's where, in terms of a standard and making sure you align. And, here at the end, we're going to have some takeaways for you. And I'm going to point you to our PCI compliance and fraud management page that has some takeaways for you. But yeah, definitely educate yourself on what the requirement is and lean on us, Engaging Networks, for advice. I mean, if you haven't been going out to our trust center, and then lean on your payment gateway. So another question is, how can nonprofits collaborate to improve data security and fraud risk? What do you think? How would you answer that? How can they collaborate? What do you think?
I can kick off here in sharing that, when you take a look at all the payments that we've processed on Stripe in 2024, let's say, it was actually like 1.4 trillion in payment volume. And so one of the things that we're doing is every time that we see a transaction that comes, from a charity, from a nonprofit, we're not just looking at that single transaction in isolation, we're actually looking at it in the context of the broader ecosystem. And we're able to use many years of data and all of that history to make a determination as to, if this is a valid and real transaction. For context, when you have a new donor that comes to your charity or nonprofit, there's actually a 93% chance that we've seen that donor before from some other charity or nonprofit. And so that's a pretty strong indicator to us as to, should we allow this donation through, or should we choose to actually block this transaction on your behalf? And so I think to answer your question very directly, Tiffany, like, what could you do to better support other charities and nonprofits when it comes to payments alone? I think the key is just ensuring that you're collecting as much data upfront about these donors and sharing that data with the payment instrument information to your processor, so that we can then make a determination on, like, hey, here's our whole ecosystem. Do we think that this is a transaction you should accept or not?
Yeah, absolutely. So totally agree. And we take a very similar approach with our fraud solutions, where we look at a verticalized kind of data and write rules and kind of see performance and transaction data at that level, so that we do look at like businesses and nonprofits to see what is the history, what is the commonality. Another kind of to layer onto that we've started really thinking is taking, everything has really been kind of a payments instrument led view and a payment-centric view of fraud and the connectivity between cards and the card history. And that's been kind of the historical approach. And with WorldPay, one of the things that with their recent acquisition with Ravelin, and just kind of as we think about the scaling of fraud networks, is taking a more customer-centric approach. So that kind of lays on to why it's so important to be capturing as much data, especially about the customer and the donor, and passing it through to your gateways is, we are able to build those connections within a network based on a consumer themselves. So, I have 5 or 6 different cards that I use on a regular basis. And, I've moved 9 times in the past 9 years. Unfortunately, I'm done moving now. But all of that kind of ties into my history. And then if you see, Tiffany, and all of a sudden Tiffany has very fraudulent behavior, but maybe we have a shared address, right? You start to link that together. You see now 2 people, 5 cards, 1 address. Well, maybe we've shared, a card once, right? So she's used a card with her email and I have an email. So you start to really build out these networks in a view that has been really, I think, impactful in the space to take that different view. And then the cool thing about it is when you see all the interconnectivity within a network, especially in something like card testing, and if you're getting data about their device, so you start to know where they're located, if people are using the same device and IPs, you can bring them down in one swipe. So you can literally take an entire graph network that's linked together, an entire fraud network, and in one click of a button, ultimately pull them down, because you can put a block on every single data element or piece of metadata associated within that network. So definitely what you're passing, sending through, we are looking across the nonprofit space to really kind of find those connectivity, find the commonality, looking for the good, but also it really helps us identify the bad and bring it down, not just for one of you, but in the cases where a lot of these are hitting multiple of you at one time and scaling across the entire industry, we can kind of take them down across the industry.
Okay. So in the interest of time, let's talk about key strategies, key trends and strategies in fraud prevention. So fraud prevention technology, what should nonprofits be doing to strengthen their risk management programs, and how much does AI play a role in that? I think you may have, you hit on that a little bit already.
I'll start. So I think, on top of obviously the data piece, which again, that's going to be my name for 2026, trying to stop it as far upstream as possible. Pre-network risk checks. So if whoever you're using for fraud, check with them, make sure you're doing these pre-network. You want to stop these attacks before they're going through to the issuers, before the networks are seeing it. And even further up, so from a technology perspective, look at your payments pages, see what data you're capturing, see if you can layer in a bit more, maybe have someone log in, right? The more kind of structure you have around it. Obviously balancing that with customer friction. There are times, you have these big donor days, but those big donor days, I'll tell you, the fraudsters are primed and ready because they know you're expecting an influx in traffic and they know that they could potentially go under, especially if $1 is one of your giving day options. So I would say go as upstream as possible. Go as upstream as possible in the process and really look at the technology within kind of where you're actually capturing the payment and see if there's throttling and different techniques you can put up there. I know CAPTCHA is one, but also what kind of prevention can you put in so that makes it harder for the fraudster to be able to just run their scripts and get hundreds of thousands of transactions through.
If I could ask, by a quick show of hands, how many of y'all have written one or more rules over the past few years to either allow payments, block payments, review payments that are coming in? How many folks have written some kind of fraud-related rules? Cool. So maybe this is a little bit of news, which is that I think those rules are going to become the old world. And the way that we're moving is such that hopefully you're going to actually have to write next to no rules about fraud ever again because of how quickly we're moving when it comes to AI and machine learning. And the reason why I say this is because many of the rules that you're writing, might be great at blocking a fraud attack when it's happening in that moment. But one of the things we see is that those rules stick around for not just 3 to 6 months, they stick around forevermore. And suddenly it becomes this conundrum of, are you actually now blocking good actors who are attempting to make a donation to your charity or nonprofit? And so I think, Tiffany, to your point about AI and ML, AI and ML are moving so quickly that we're going to be able to use automated machine learning to make a much more educated decision on should you actually allow or block this traffic. I'll give you just some concrete other things that you and your teams should be thinking about when it comes to like what other levers are at your disposal. You should be thinking about, to Christy's point, some velocity rules. When there are moments where you do see a single bad actor making hundreds, thousands of transactions, you should be thinking about 3D Secure, even here in the United States, as a means of shifting liability onto issuers. You should be thinking about address and zip code related checks. So making sure that the data that you're getting from your consumers is being checked against the payment instrument data. I'll share a few more. You could think about email address and two-factor authentication with a phone number. You could also think about using something like CAPTCHA. And when I say CAPTCHA, everyone kind of tends to cringe because you think about, pick the ones with traffic lights. But that's not just what CAPTCHA is. CAPTCHA can also be a passive experience where we're actually just collecting data about the consumer and their device history and using that to make a determination on, is this a good or bad actor? The very last thing that I'll say is really think about your policies. So when a donation is being made, it could be helpful to be really explicit in your policies, when is a refund allowed, when is it forbidden, especially when it comes to recurring subscriptions.
All right, so now I want to move to key takeaways, and I've asked each of them to leave us with a key takeaway quote. So this is from Christy at WorldPay.
Yeah, I'll say it. So, and it didn't say data, but I say, card testing attacks. So they are on the rise. They are the vulnerability. They are the risk that I think continues to kind of be prominent in the space. So, especially, with the open donation pages, so completely low friction or no friction experiences, they're higher at risk. So, to layer in, I think Josh said it, I said it, velocity checks, bin filtering, that's a rule. Some of you probably who write the rules see that there's bin. So we do a lot with bin logic, bin trending, network decline rates, and looking for the anomaly detection, right? So that ties back to, does the, device data match the shipping address data? Does the email information match their historical behavior? So really trying to understand as much as you can about the anomaly there. And that's, again, when we talk about that shared responsibility, as much as you can put on to partners like us who can do that on your behalf, let us, that's what we're good at. That's what our teams do. That's what our systems are built to do. So definitely, work with us. We're always happy to help. But, I say here, it's not about saying no to generosity. It's about saying yes securely, and building that consumer trust is definitely important because, we understand that donors are important and all the revenue you guys can get into your organizations is also important. So
Thank you, Christy. And now, Josh?
Wow, this is way too wordy now that I'm seeing it on the slide. I think, look, at the end of the day, our job is to figure out who is a genuine donor and really well-intentioned versus who's a bad actor. Your job is to figure out how to run such a successful and impactful nonprofit or charity organization. And so we want to empower you to do that as best as you can. And I think our role in it should be to try and figure out, who are those good actors versus who are those bad actors. And you should really, think about your payment provider as kind of an ally to you in making that determination so that your team isn't having to focus on fraud, chargebacks, and disputes.
Very good. And then lastly, I'll point you to these considerations and tips from our Engaging Networks fraud management knowledge page. So if you haven't seen this, I would encourage you to go out and look at that. I would assume that many of you have seen this, but this just talks about what has already really been said here today. The fact that Ian has supported the integration of some of our payment gateways. CAPTCHA, we've talked about CAPTCHA already, automated IP blocking, email and SMS alerts, spam traps, a bunch of this stuff. So just go out to this page and look at this. But of course, I'm still harping on stay aligned with PCI compliance. I can't end without talking about PCI compliance. Manage challenges. Big key: close unused pages. And complete the Security Academy courses. So we have courses out there that will aid you. So I'll stop now and ask, do we have any questions here? Because if there are any technical deep dive, we've got the guru sitting over there in the corner.
Grab that microphone right behind you.
Okay.
It's under your chair. Yeah, yes, we do have quite a few questions here, and some interesting directions these have taken too, honestly. With the first one being, a little bit off topic, but I'm interested in hearing this. With presidential memorandums and executive orders increasingly targeting and intimidating nonprofit orgs and their donors, how are payment processors preparing for the possibility of being asked by government agencies to disclose donor data from nonprofits that use your gateways and that may be wrongly targeted by the federal government? So information that comes from nonprofits to Stripe or WorldPay. How do you approach that?
I think we probably will both have the same answers. That would probably have to be directed to someone else. Listen, we are data security driven, right? We are big organizations with a ton of data that have a lot of regulatory and compliance, right? We are banks, basically. We are financial institutions, and there's nothing more important to us than the protection of all of your data, all of your consumer data. We are not in the business to do anything with that data that we are not expected to, required to, and agreed to. As far as I don't know that again, there's a whole nother team that probably answers those questions, but I do know, from our perspective, we do not do anything with the data other than, try to leverage it to protect you from fraud. And that is really our scope. But again, interesting question. I wish I had an answer, but I know we are not planning or would expect to do anything with your data, your consumer data that, is not agreed upon and is explicitly approved by all of you. Yeah, that's it.
All right.
You'll probably put a link to you can reach out to someone on the WorldPay page.
Okay, and so this one I think we did kind of cover. Maybe, Tiffany, if you still have the ability to control the slides, we could go back to that slides. But the question is, what do you wish more nonprofits were doing on their forms, so these would be engaging networks forms, to prevent fraud or stopping fraud as it's happening? And I think really, from an engaging networks perspective, what we recommend are those steps there that were up on the screen. And if you... I don't either, but these slides should be available for you in the app, so make sure to take a look at that. And there's also a pretty elaborate support article on all the things you can put there. Does Tiffany or anyone else, anything you'd like to add to that, or even Ken? Ken has a very interesting perspective on this because he's mostly looking at the back end of all of your forms.
I'll keep it short and sweet. Some things you can do before you actually see fraud. Understand how your web page is developed. If you're using third-party libraries, where are they hosted? Are they reliable? How are they protected against supply chain attacks? It's in the security world, it's called harden your target. You want to make sure that your web page or your donation page is configured as securely as possible. And what does that mean? That means you're using approved legitimate scripts. With PCI DSS, there's the new script inventory and script attestation that's going on. But that's a lot of unknown words for non-technical people. So they don't really understand what that means. But the short story is, if you're using scripts on your pages, make sure you're vetting them. Make sure your developers understand, how they're being used, who developed them, and there's no backdoors in them. The second component is, adding a minimum card donation. I know a lot of our clients don't like that, but that's an easy way to prevent that. If your pages do have vulnerabilities, make sure they're addressed. With the PCI DSS ASV, you're required to do that. But when you do page development, use what's called the OWASP Top 10 Web Development checklist. It'll help you ensure that your web pages are developed using industry best practices. Because a lot of people that facilitate fraud have to find a page to do it on. They have to find a page they want to exploit. And they do that by using something called Google Dorks or searching for pages that have vulnerabilities or that have weaknesses. For example, DCOM vulnerabilities or DCOM weaknesses. Once they find those pages, that becomes very lucrative for them to try and exploit and try and develop scripts and use those to facilitate carding and other financial fraud. Another best practice that I want to make sure that we put on our supportal is content security policies. We have that functionality. We rolled that out this year. I wish more of our clients were utilizing that because that further, helps protect your page. So those are a few handful of items. And if you have other questions, feel free to, funnel those through Tiffany, and we'll be happy to help you.
Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, the accounts
He was
team.
the wizard.
And the accounts team and support team is happy to work with you on that too. It's always a battle between having things as secure as possible, but also reducing barriers to conversion, right? So we can work internally with Ken and Tiffany to try to work with you to strike that right balance. Okay, there are some really interesting questions, but we are out of time for this session. So I do want to encourage you to bring them to us, bring them to our fine panelists. There was a really interesting question on data privacy with all the protections that they've been talking about, so I would love to hear the answer for that, so feel free to ask about that. Okay, thank you very much to our panelists.